So the last 4 decades, it's really China is able to do 4 things that nobody else is able to do. And that 4 big debt today need to be redeemed at some point. We have the cheapest cost of capital in the world over the last 30 years. So with the cheapest cost of land, the cheapest cost of labor, the cheapest cost of environment, and cheapest cost of capital, that 4 debt need to be redeemed. So you are allocating loss to a generation of our rural population. If you compensate equitably and fairly for that, then the system has no real legitimacy issue.
Charles Lee, the founder and chairman of MicroConnect. Charles, you've been a very famous investment banker and for many years the chief executive of Hong Kong Stock Exchange. So you know the global capital market, you know the concept, basically the sentiment of the global investors. How do you see the narrative among the global investors on investing in China has evolved?
Yeah, I think when we want to understand China, we need to really look back into the history and us also really look inside China rather than just looking at China economy as a whole as to how it's going to go externally. And I think if we go back to ask the question, why China has succeeded so wildly, and are those reasons are still here, and are they still driving China today? So I think the reason China succeeded so widely over the last 30-some years that no other country has ever been able to pull, if you have to really put the credit to where, I think is really 4 big, what I call allocation of losses. You know, we think China's economy, people think it's a state-planned economy, so it's a China government in the allocation of resources. That's not really what's China. China is really about the ability to allocate losses. So the last 4 decades, it's really China is able to do 4 things that nobody else is able to do. And that 4 big debt today need to be redeemed at some point. So the first one is we were able to essentially allocate losses to our rural population to say, hey, you guys, all of you, your land can be aggregated for urbanization, industrialization with the least compensation. So we were able to aggregate land into our urbanization and industrialization with a fraction of the cost that any other country would otherwise have to pay for the landowners, number 1. Number 2, we allocated losses to our entire rural population to say, well, you guys need to sacrifice. You can come into the city, build our modernization and urbanization, but at a fraction of wages that you otherwise should be able to win anywhere else. So 400 million migrant workers came into the city, built our modernization with a fraction of what they otherwise should be entitled to. 3, we were able to allocate huge losses to our environment for 30 years. We were able to destroy our rivers and forests at will. And therefore, we were able to modernize and urbanize and industrialize with the least environmental cost. And lastly, we were able to allocate a particular deprivation of rights for depositors, that your money cannot be moved around at will. You have to put that into our banking system. So therefore, we have the cheapest cost of capital in the world over the last 30 years. So with the cheapest cost of land, the cheapest cost of labor, the cheapest cost of environment, and cheapest cost of capital, and then with all the urban city mayors and everybody competing on that 4 dimensions, Wall Street has nowhere to go over the last 30 years. So money just gets sucked into China because you can never modernize and urbanize a huge economy like this with that kind of a cost structure. So then what's today? Where is the wealth? So we were here today, we are here today. So the key question to ask about China is who has that wealth that was created over the last 30, 40 years? I don't think anybody has done any empirical study, but my hunch is that 50% of that is still within states' hands. This is essentially a pre-tax system that the state is able to pre-tax everything up front. So therefore, 50% is still within the states and 20% with the urban population of 20%. And then maybe 10% somewhere, call that a corruption commission or whatever, that belongs to a smaller fraction of the bureaucracy. So that's why we have to take corruption out of it. So 20% probably with the 80% of the population. But it's not entirely widely unequal because 50% is still within the state. So the key question about China is how this 50% is ever going to be redistributed. If that's going to be redistributed with corruption, you know where it's going to go exactly the same ratio. So therefore, corruption has to be out, and so we can focus on the 50%. So today, looking at that, essentially you're looking at a country that has finally urbanized and industrialized with reasonably good wealth distribution, because 20% of the wealth is in 20% of the urban population, with a lot of unequalness in there, but it's not massively because we have the 50%. So looking at China, we need to understand in the next 30 years is how this 50% is going to get redistributed. We're no longer caring as much about incremental growth. It doesn't change too much anymore because adding another a few tables doesn't make a lot of people sitting down, because you have a lot of table back in the other room, which is the 50%, that people are looking at that tables to say, what can you bring that table out so that we can all sit down? So how that 50% is going to go back to redeem that full original big debt, help our rural population. That's why all the infrastructure goes there. All the urban homes are becoming livable, because when migrant workers left 30 years ago, they never meant to go back. But now they're going back. Everything is okay there. That's why we don't have urban ghettos. And then we have to spend money going back to the migrant workers to make sure they are able to have rental homes in the city. The children can go to, they can have some medical, guarantees. They can have some sort of a pension. With a lot of money have to go back redistributed to fix the environment, which is happening. Nothing is being done much to the capital market. So that's what we're really seeing today. So in the future, incremental growth, important, but not as important if you can figure out a much better way of fixing the redistribution of that 50%. And with AI, with everything else, that 50% is going to be distributed into building a better China, hopefully that ultimately still go back and repay that big debt, the full big debt. And I think that paying off that debt is the future of China. And we are on the way of doing it.
You've been working with global investors for ages. How is their perception of the China story these days? And is there anything that they misunderstood?
Well, that's very general, because a lot of people thinking of China very differently. There are people who cannot, have enough of China. There are people sometimes who hate China so much. So it's hard to speak. But if you think of China in that context that I just talked about, and I think the domestic China market, now, because of Stock Connect, everybody can invest into China. Chinese are investing out into Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is becoming a very big centralized market where anything about China, whether it's Chinese underlying or it's Chinese capital, is aggregating there. So you need to understand the Chinese capital perspective very well in order for you to participate in it, because they are going to be defining a lot of ways how things are invested. Domestic market, Asian market in China, as in my earlier framing, it's like a Three Gorges Dam. It's a capital controlled market. When it's a capital controlled market, when you're in there, you feel like a big ocean, like you are in international market, but it is not. It's 1,000 meters in altitude, which means that the interest spread there is massive. Everything is protected. By denying your depositors the freedom to move your money away, the social contract is such that you have to guarantee the safety. So guarantee the safety of the financial system in China simply means that the Chinese capital has no immunity, because it doesn't really know. You can have a banking system with a 20% NPL and nobody's still wrong on the bank, because everybody has such a blind faith and confidence in the system protecting the financial system. So therefore, that system itself is just not an investable market in the sense that because people don't believe in risk, because people even don't think the bank will fall, with 20% NPL. So therefore, investing inside China is something that need to really take full account of that environment. But coming out and looking at China today, with that redistribution story, you need to really watch how that money is being invested. That is invested to pay debt, as I already talked about it. So anything in that direction, you can make a lot of money. This is not about helping the urban elite anymore. It's not about helping the people who are able to travel and buy, LV bags anymore. This is about making sure that even in the countryside, in the rural countryside today, babies wear diapers. That might be something you think it's a very, and take for granted issue. But when we grow up, we don't have diapers. We wash cloths and then, line them up and dry. So now even the poorest, rural families use diapers for their kids. So all of that is paying debt into the farmers, into the infrastructure, and then into AI. And in terms of consumers, we talked about it. I think China increasingly is going to, if you really want to invest in consumer, trying to bet which brand is going to be a spectacular success. This is equity story investment is really running out of space first in China. Simply because when your investment is require another investor to like it better than you and then pay more than you paid, that entire investment paradigm is no longer working effectively in China. So for consumer investing, cash flow investment is going to be the future. That you are not really trying to bet whether this brand or this chain is going to be spectacularly listing, giving you 100 times return. You're talking about investing in a period of a cash flow that you're comfortable and aggregating hundreds of thousands of cash flow and creating a stable alpha that ultimately is going to work, and that's only going to work in China, and that's the only thing that works for China's consumer into the future. You can still continue to bet, but the way to invest in the broadest consumer sector is to find a way to invest in cash flows.
And if we talk about money get into China, we can not ignore the question of how to get money out of China. So the exit question, Charles, I'll turn that to you, especially given your experience leading the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Is it easy to move to exit from China investment?
Well, I think China need to. I think for the foreseeable future that we can see as an investor as a horizon, I don't see China meaningfully changing its capital control system, because going back to my original framing, until and unless that 50% is properly redistributed, I don't think there is going to be any meaningful efforts trying to find a way, because the Chinese, a lot of the private capital, even some of the state capitals wanted to go out, and there are a lot of opportunities, but that redistribution need to take place first. And that's first and foremost. So I don't really see China changing that particular political structure anytime soon until it sees confidence. Because that full debt needs to be redeemed. It's not a debt you can incur infinitely, because you are allocating loss to a generation of our rural population. And we need to make sure that their second half of their life that need to be properly compensated. If you compensate equitably and fairly for that, then the system has no real legitimacy issue, because you're simply, unlike in the West, you couldn't really make allocations of losses. You have to build a super speed train from Chicago to New York, but you can't find land to do it, because you couldn't really negotiate and be able to find the most efficient land that benefit everybody, and then be able to compensate the people you have to force to move. Today, if China is able to compensate equitably and fairly, then you're simply saying, well, you guys 30 years of loss, and now your 30 years we're going to compensate it properly. So I think that needs to happen that way. But this redistribution in the overall context of the AI revolution, I think the world need to watch over China, because China is going to, in so many ways, have such a strong advantage because of the availability of this 50%. Because in AI, we're really talking about three levels like a pyramid. At the top is AI changing our humans' mental activities. In the middle is AI is changing our physical activities. And at the bottom is the global energy level that support this AI new age revolution, because the energy consumption of new generation AI is going to be so massive that we are not really thinking about it other than China. And China is doing it also on green, whether that's solar, whether that's wind, whether that's nuclear. And that foundation, I thought most of the countries have already lost the ability to build infrastructure, investing in that future on that scale. And that scale require massive national efforts and international efforts, because we're not going to stay here unless we have the bottom. And then all the real AI value to humans ultimately is going to be in the hardware. It's ultimately going to be in the robotics. We really wanted our daily lives, not our just labors, and not our elite's life, entertainment and everything else becoming AI enabled. We're talking about our labors, our mid part of the population be liberated from hard labor. So therefore, the chips and the AI ultimately need to be in manufacturing. And that, again, China is going to be ahead, and that massive redistribution, a huge portion of the capital will go there, and then private capital will follow. It is the top. Obviously, the US is leading at the very tip of the big models, and the application, hopefully China will follow. But that, again, is solving your entertainment needs and your softer needs. Those are not really, at the end of the day, going to be really life-changing as much as what is going to happen in the middle. And unless you have the bottom, the middle is not going to be there. And unless you have the bottom and the middle, and the top is not going to really make any meaningful difference in life.
If you have 10 seconds with China's policymakers to give your suggestion, what will be one suggestion in terms of the policy that you'll give them?
Say it again so that I can have more time.
10 give 10 seconds elevator pitch to China's policymaker. What smart policy they should adopt?
I have nothing to offer to you. You have your hands full.